You're listening to Within Tolerance, a podcast for machinists by machinists. I'm your host, Dylan Jackson from Proteum Machining. And this week I'm joined by Joe Kaslowski of Random Fabrication. Welcome, Joe.
Hey, Dylan, how's it going, man?
Doing well. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, anytime.
If anybody doesn't know who you are or what you do, where can they find you online and what do you do?
Yeah, so again, my name's Joe Kaslowski. Kind of own and operate Random Fabrication. It's kind of a hobby that's turned into a little bit more than a hobby. I'm on Instagram as at Random Fabrication. And so it's just one of those things that back in the day just kind of started doing my thing and got into metalworking and machine tools, and it's kind of snowballed from there.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have accused me of being very particular with my guests and picking everybody who has Speedios, but really I wanted to have you on when you had your Fadal. And I just had a bunch of people reach out and say, hey, you got to get Joe on. So I promise, guys, everyone who's listening, I'm not just picking Speedio owners. You don't have to get a Speedio to come on the podcast.
I thought that was part of the requirement. That's what you sent me in the notes.
Well, so you mentioned, you got into metalworking. So how did you get to where you are now and having a Speedio in your garage?
Yeah, so about, I want to say 10 years ago, 2010, 2011-ish, I've always been into cars. When I was 14, 15, 16, I was huge into Mustangs. Particularly, I really wanted like an old fastback 65, 66 Mustang. That was like my dream car. So back and forth with my parents, I started getting closer and closer to driving. And my parents were very like adamant about, it's old, you're going to have to work on it all the time, it's going to break down. So their compromise was a 5-liter, like one of the Fox body Mustangs. So it was like a little bit newer car at the time. This was, I graduated high school in 99. So I'm talking, 95, 96, 97, 98. It's like getting into these cars and stuff like that. And so at that time, that was like the compromises. I mean, don't get me wrong, like everybody else, I drove, the crappy car in high school or whatever. And then when I finally had enough money to buy a car, it was like, no, we don't want you to have an old Mustang, but, we'll come to a compromise. If you want a Mustang, you can do like the mid 90s 5.0. So my first car was a 90 GT 5-liter, 5-speed. And that was life at that point. Like once I got into cars, like everything else like didn't matter. That's all I did day and night was build motors, work on stuff, hang out at friends' houses with cars. And so that was pretty much the whole thing up until got out of college and did all that. And then kind of got a job and life and all that stuff started happening, kind of dropped cars. And then probably in 2010-ish, I had my own place. I had some projects going on. I was actually restoring this dresser that I had bought, kind of like an old, 60s era vintage dresser. I was like, what would be really cool is like take these kind of janky wooden feet off and make like aluminum, or some sort of round metal foot. Like, how do I do that? So down the YouTube rabbit hole I went, you know what I mean? And all of a sudden it was like, well, I guess I need a metal lathe. And so that that was like the pinpoint moment of ending up with a Speedio in my garage. So it's kind of crazy because you talk to a lot of people that have kind of the same experiences. And I think that's why there's such a draw to it sometimes, is that a lot of people kind of have the same story where you just get into these random little projects and you get into these oddball things, and then just one thing leads to another. And before you know it, you're doing work for other people. You're just kind of on your own, just figuring some of this stuff out. And I've met so many people along the way that it's just kind of crazy. It's, you reach out to people and if you just kind of put yourself out there, it's kind of crazy what you can figure out. And then, obviously this day and age with YouTube and internet, and I'm such a junkie when it comes to forums and learning. There's just so much free information out there now that it's kind of insane.
So you got this lathe, and then what was your next step? You accomplished that project. How did you get into mills and making more things than just table legs?
Yeah, so I was super interested in the lathe. I did a bunch of research. I ended up buying an 11-inch Logan that Ken actually still has. And so it was one of those things that I love that little lathe. It was great. And it was just like everything else, it was just like cars. It was just like any other hobby. I'm kind of one of those people that it's you're either completely uninterested or you're obsessed, so that's just kind of my personality, that I never really half-ass anything. It's kind of if I get into something and I either, do it for a couple months and I just get tired of it and drop it and probably never pick it up again, or, I'm obsessed and it's like all I can think about. And so that's kind of like where it ended up going with that. And from the beginning, I was always interested in CNC, but I was, it's like a lot of people, I think, starting out, you're scared to death to actually go out and buy, a CNC. And just, I knew nothing about code. I knew nothing about, I was familiar with computers and stuff, but I didn't know anything about actually operating a machine. And, obviously with YouTube and some of the stuff you've seen, you see CNC crashes and you see people talking about crashes. And so you're just like, oh man, I can't see myself going out and spending 5, 10, 15 grand or whatever on a machine and then crashing it and ruining some expensive piece of equipment. So kind of my next foray into that was like, well, I'm just going to build a CNC plasma table. So I started kind of getting into machining stuff, and I had the lathe, and I ended up buying a Induma, kind of Bridgeport clone mill, and I used those for a lot of time. And then I kind of got more into equipment, and I started buying and selling equipment and kind of figuring out what I liked and didn't like. So I had a lot of manual equipment at the time, and was kind of getting more and more into tools and all that kind of stuff. And so I think it was 2013-ish, something like that. I just jumped over the edge and ended up ordering a kit, a CNC plasma kit. So I basically ended up building the whole frame, building the whole CNC plasma table, and I built a whole 4x8 CNC plasma table by myself in my garage. And so I bought the gantry and I bought an electronics kit. And this was kind of when plasma was kind of coming into its own. And now you can find a lot of these, now you can buy complete tables for less than I think I spent for the whole thing.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like I have a couple buddies that have these things that are so good, and it's 5, 6, obviously it's like CNCs, you can spend as much as you want on pro tables and everything. But, it's so crazy to see that some of these kits and stuff back then, it was, you kind of had to piece everything together and you kind of had to get all the stuff. So I went down that rabbit hole and just started buying everything and bought a gantry. And so I ran that for a couple years and I was totally into it. I loved making stuff. It's anybody that's gotten into CNC, there's just something that's satisfying about the first time you push the button, you know what I mean? That you've programmed a part and you push the button and then you watch that thing move. And I think for anybody that's gotten into CNC, it's probably something you'll never forget,
Oh yeah. Yeah. I still have the first part I programmed myself and ran on a CNC. And like, I didn't even finish it because my boss at the time had kind of given me something that overwhelmed my skill level. But I got through a few ops and like, I still have that hunk of junk somewhere just to be like, yep, that's the first thing I programmed. That's cool.
Yeah, mine was literally a square out of like 1/4-inch plate because it was like a CNC plasma table. And you're just like, I drew this square in sheet cam, you know what I mean? And put it into Mach 3 and ran it. And it was like, oh my God, I just told this robot to cut this thing out.
And it did it. Yeah.
Yeah. And after months, years, whatever of, working on cars, doing stuff by hand, and you're like, man, just sitting there with a grinder or sitting there at a bandsaw and like cutting something out and grinding it to size, it's like, I need these 4 caster plate things or whatever, you know what I mean? And okay, it took me a little while to make 4 of them. Well, it's like, okay, this plasma table just made 4 of them in about 30 seconds. So that was kind of like the start of the addiction, and then it just kept getting worse. And so I got more into sign making and a lot of that stuff. But as much as I enjoyed kind of the plasma table part of it, I had always really wanted, I'd seen the videos and stuff like that. I've always been interested in CNC, like machining, especially milling. And so I ran the plasma table for a couple years and was making money. I was doing a lot of signs, but the logistics of trying to operate a plasma table, like in a garage setting, especially like a larger, like I had a 4x8 table. So it was just getting a request for bigger material, bigger, I was driving to the metal place, I'd be getting 15, 20, 30, 40 sheets of like 14 gauge or 11 gauge. You know what I mean? So it's in the back of my truck, dragging these sheets out of the bed of my truck, like onto the table. I had ended up working with a local powder coat shop and was doing a lot of their plasma cutting. And he started wanting like 3/8 plate and 1/2 inch plate. And it's just like, this is breaking me, so it's
Right.
just,
Oh yeah.
I've just got these memories of like me standing in the back of my truck, dragging a 4x4 sheet of 1/2 inch plate, out of my
Oof.
truck, like onto the plasma table.
Right.
You know what I mean? And it was that kind of stuff that just got logistically overwhelming and just annoying, I guess. And so I just kind of made the decision that this is not, I kept getting busier. And I was like, if I don't cut this off now and kind of go the direction that I want to go, that I'm just going to keep going down that road and going down a path like I'm not really that interested in. So it was kind of right about 2015, I think 2016. I had it for a couple of years, and well, it must have been right after that because I had met Ken. So Ken Zodiac Engineering and I have been friends for quite a long time now. And we met randomly off and out on Craigslist. He came and looked at a machine that I had for sale. And he looks over and he sees like a BMX bike hanging in my garage. He's like, "Hey man, you ride BMX?" Like, not as much as I used to, but yeah. And at the time I was big into mountain biking, and I was way more into mountain biking. I was like, yeah, but I still, ride BMX. He's like, oh man. So we just started BSing about mountain biking and machining and all this stuff. And, Ken's such an awesome guy, and we've been friends for a long time now. And he's probably the number one person that's helped me out, as far as this kind of whole journey. And, he's kind of like my Obi-Wan. So I got into that. I ended up doing a Kickstarter for my wallets that I make. I had kind of manually machined one of my like I had this idea for like the wallet and just kind of manually machined one. And it was pretty rough because it was all manual machining and I wasn't very good at it. But, I talked with Ken, and at the time he had a Fadal, and he was just like, oh yeah, we can run those. At that time, that was the whole kind of upcoming of Fusion 360. So it was the whole, hey, check out this program, like learn, if you want to like design something. And so there was just hours and hours at night of learning Fusion 360 and, hey, how do I do this? How do I do this? How do I do this? And so it was just kind of like everything kind of fell into place where it was a way to like learn CAD, start to learn some of the CAM, even though I didn't have a machine at the time, was kind of poke around and see how things work and try to figure it out, ask Ken questions all the time, like I still do. And so I ended up doing the Kickstarter in I think about 2016, something like that. And so that was really my first kind of foray into like CNC machining. And then after that point, I was like, this is where I want to go. I sold the plasma table, and I looked around and I found this old Toyosiki mill, which is basically like a drill tap center. It's kind of like, if you ordered a Brother from wish.com or something. So it was an 88 or 89, something like that. It was a old Fanic OM mate control. And when I went out and looked at it, I was able to send programs. The guy showed me a bunch of stuff. I was like, okay, sweet. This thing's here. So I got it home, and honestly, it was like a great little machine, and ran a bunch of parts, ran wallets on it. But the big problem was the memory was capped on it. I think it has like 32K or something like that, something ridiculous. And so I went around and around. There's a great Fanic guy here in Southern California that does a lot of work, that I ended up getting a hold of, and he came out and looked at the machine, and he's like, dude, I don't want to give you the bad news, but if you literally had any other controller, I could probably add memory to it. He's like, this one was like the bottom of the barrel. It was just probably meant to do one thing, as far as like when the company bought it or whatever. He's like, you're just kind of SOL on upgrading it. So it was just, that was the point where I'm like, okay, if I really want to grow and learn more stuff, like I'm going to have to get something else. And so I ended up selling that. And that's when I kind of jumped into the Fadal. So the Fadal was about, I want to say, because I had the Fadal for 2 years. So I had the Toyosiki for about a year. And then I sold that and I bought the Fadal. I was actually kind of looking around for a long time and wanted like a little bit bigger machine, a little bit bigger table, all that kind of stuff. And then I absolutely wanted a 10K spindle and some of these other things that now even though I had a little bit of experience, I was like, okay, I need something I could drip feed at least, better control, all these kind of upgrade things. And so I ended up finding a listing for the Fadal Practical Machinist, and it was this like instrumentation company. And I ended up talking to the guy, and he sent me some pictures, and I really wanted to go out and take a look at it, but the timing didn't work out. And so I ended up buying it sight unseen. But, the guy had sent me a bunch of pictures, and just seeing their shop, it was one of those shops where it was like everything's, epoxy coated and it's just pristine. Right. You're like, okay, I think I'm pretty sure I'm good here. And the guy was super helpful. And it was just one of those where you get a good feeling right from the get-go. And, he was telling me like, yeah, we don't even have enough people to run it. We have, 20 machines or whatever, and we only have like 8 employees that actually CNC. So I think they just left the machine set up for, certain jobs. And then it was like, okay, if we need to run XYZ job, then we just go use this machine. And if we need to run this job, we go use that machine. And so it sounded like they'd only ran like maybe 10 or 15 hours a week, if that. And he's like, wow. There's weeks where the machine doesn't even run, And so when I bought it, it was a 2001 and it only had about 13,000 hours on it.
That's great.
Yeah. So it was a 10K spindle, and it kind of threw me for a loop until I figured out what it was, because I had an issue with a switch go bad when I first got it. But it was the air oil injection spindle, which was standard for the 15K. And so that made troubleshooting a little bit difficult until some of the people I was talking to figured out that it had that spindle, because there was like a little Hobbs switch that controlled the air oil injection that went bad. And it was, ended up being a $15 part on Amazon or whatever.
Right. You thought it was like a spindle, I bet, or something. You're like,
yeah,
oh, great.
So what it was is it runs a self-check when you fire up the machine and you run everything. So I'd be running parts and I'd start running. And then 15 minutes, it was basically like you hit the e-stop. So the machine would just stop. And it wasn't getting a signal from that switch, basically saying that the air oil injection system was good. And so it would just shut. So I was freaking out. It was like a couple days on and off. It was like, I figured out that I could turn the machine on and run parts and do this, but any extended run times, it would just shut down. So I was freaking out. So I finally got that figured out with the help of a dude that used to work at Fadal. And but honestly, that was really the only issue I ever had with that machine, other than, just maintenance stuff and things like that. It was pretty basic. It was a great machine. It got me where I needed to go. At least mine, super reliable. I mean, it held good tolerance, never had any issues with it. It ran, obviously it fit in the garage. So that was a big plus. I had it running on a 15 horsepower rotary phase converter. So for anybody that's thinking about Fadals, I think they're great machines for what I paid for it. I think I paid low teens for it, like 13 or something for it. And then it cost a couple grand for shipping and rigging, and then rigging, getting it off. But pretty much all said and done, I mean, it was under 20 grand to get it tooled up here, set, all that stuff. And then, so I had that from about October, November of 2018 until I just bought the Speedio in 2020, in basically October of 2020. So it was about a 2-year gap. But yeah, man, as far as the Speedio goes, I know I don't have to tell you, but it's freaking awesome.
Yeah. Well, real quick, before we go into that, there's a couple things I wanted to touch on that you said. First, the idea of going down the rabbit hole on hobbies, I think, is very close and dear to my heart, and like my business partner and friend too. Like, there was a reel or something that popped up that was talking about like hyperfixation on hobbies, and I empathized and like felt it so deeply, because like, I'll find something I'm interested in, hyperfixate on it, consume all the information I can find on it, buy all the stuff I want for it, and if I like it, I continue. But then, like you said, sometimes I'll just dump it, and it's like, nope, okay, well, I learned what I wanted out of that. On to the next one. Like,
yeah, it's literally like a light switch. It's crazy.
Yeah,
it's you're either on it, and there's a couple things, and I've actually been like that with mountain biking the same way. So kind of a fun fact is today is actually the year anniversary of me breaking my neck on my mountain bike.
Well, I am glad you're still here and alive and seemingly doing pretty well for such a serious accident.
Yeah, so I had a pretty bad crash on Super Bowl Sunday of last year, and then without getting into too much crazy details, like I didn't really know my neck was broken at the time.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
so I crashed pretty hard. Buddy got me. We walked out. It was kind of like mid COVID. We were up in Santa Cruz, California, and it was just kind of like one of those chill weekends riding with a couple buddies. But it was Sunday. It was the very end of the weekend. We'd already ridden a couple days, and it was, obviously I was sore and felt like, I needed some recovery, but it was, it took a little while, and it was just like, oh man, if anybody that's ever ridden mountain bikes or, anything like that, is you take your lumps, you know what I mean? So you just kind of get used to some level of pain after a while, and ended up going to the emergency room, or not the emergency room, but just making an appointment with my regular prac a couple days later, and went in and they did, MRI and x-ray and stuff like that, and called me later that night with a neurosurgeon calling me saying, not to rush you or concern you, but we would like you to come in as soon as possible.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. So it's kind of weird because the whole story is kind of weird because it was just, there was a lot of stuff missed at the hospital. That was one of the questions that I brought up, is how did I actually get allowed to leave, from the hospital? And I asked the surgeon that, and he said it was a point of contention. And so there's all this kind of crazy stuff, but yeah, I broke my neck on the 7th. I went in for my initial x-ray on the 9th, or I went on my initial x-ray on the 9th, and then I went back, and they called me back in basically. So I went to the hospital like 2 different times and walked out, and then ended up going back in and getting admitted after being called, after like a neurosurgeon looking at everything and telling me. So I basically crushed my C6 vertebrae. And so, yeah, February 11th of last year, I had a spinal fusion of my C5 to T1.
Jeez.
So that was a year ago today. So, but yeah, I'm super lucky. The surgeon basically told me that the way I broke it is kind of what saved my life and or ability to walk and use my limbs, because he said just kind of part of the spinal, part of my spine basically broke off, and that's what kept, that piece was what kept me from not having any impingement on my spinal cord. So when everything kind of shifted back, there was nothing to really pinch my spinal cord, and so ended up getting pretty lucky. So it's one of those things that kind of shifts your focus on your day-to-day life and what's important and what's not important. And
Oh, yeah.
sitting on your butt for 4 months, in a brace with nothing to do, gives you a lot of time to watch machining videos and ponder life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
I had a serious motorcycle accident in 2012, I think it was. And it was like the turning point of my life. It was, I was just starting to like not really like engineering school and try to figure out what I wanted to do. And then, I was bedridden for like 3 months and
yeah,
came out of that with like a very new appreciation of what life was and finding your passion and all that stuff.
yeah, really. I mean, so yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're kind of had a similar situation of, it really does shift your focus on like what's important, and it makes a lot of things seem petty, and it makes a lot of things seem, it kind of, I guess it kind of just separates the wheat from the chaff, in the sense of, you have all this stuff going on in your life, and it just really makes you think about what's important, what's not important, and for me, it was like family and wife and kids, and, what you do, and, who you associate with, and those kind of things. Like, don't let people drag you down, don't let certain people drag you down, or don't waste your time on that stuff, or worry about getting too wrapped up in that. So
Yeah, it really is. I used to be like very quick to anger and wanted to like fight everything. And after my accident, it was like, it's just not worth it. Like, you can think whatever you want. Let's continue our lives. This petty
it's weird.
argument's not worth it.
It's weird because I've almost had the same. It's weird because I've almost had the same thing where it's just, you get to this point where you're like, man, I'm, I could have easily just been erased from this planet, and you just every day after that is just something to enjoy, and it's just not worth it's just not worth wasting energy on negative stuff like that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and actually, I reached out for questions from my audience, and the Milling Miller just wrote in and said, just let him know he's appreciated and that we're still glad he's around after the accident. So clearly, everybody in the community really is happy you're still around. I mean,
Yeah,
me
man.
as well. I know I remember seeing your post, and I was like, holy shit, this is terrible.
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing to be grateful, I mean, not only that, but I mean, huge shout out to my wife, Michelle. She went through so much, and it was like one of those things that she was always terrified of me riding bikes. It's crazy when and I'm probably a little bit crazier than most people riding bikes. If people have seen pictures or whatever, I mean, it's like machining. I try to learn and push it and stuff like that. I'm definitely not the best rider or anything like that, but, probably, a lot more risky than a lot of people are. And so, it's like, people see pictures or they see, stuff from Whistler, you're going to break your neck. I'm like, well, I guess, it happened. But so it was kind of crazy, but huge shout out to my wife. Like, even with the machining stuff, she's super supportive. Just kind of a off topic sort of funny story is actually the day I was coming home from my surgery. I'm big into audio video stuff. I have a home theater set up kind of thing in our living room. And so, it was like a Saturday, and I keep telling my wife, like, oh yeah, I don't think they're gonna let me go until Monday. Monday. And and then the nurse comes in and she's like looking at some stuff, and so she's like, okay, well, if we take the catheter out and your drain tube looks good, you could probably go home today. I'm like, okay. So that was the Saturday. So I tell my wife, like, oh, they're probably gonna let me come home today. And it was like 8-9 o'clock in the morning, and she's like, okay. And then so come to find out later that about 10 o'clock that morning, when she was getting a bunch of stuff ready to go, my then 5-year-old decided to throw his Thor hammer through our living room TV.
Oh no.
So yeah. So here's my wife, like, already stressed out of her mind that her husband that just had spinal surgery is coming home. I literally am not going to be able to do anything besides sit in a recliner for the first like probably month and watch TV. And our 5-year-old had just broken the living room TV. So yeah, one of my good buddies, Todd, he's actually on Instagram too. He actually does machining, and we've been friends for a while. Bell Reel Co. He makes like CNC reels, fishing reels. And so she called Todd, and she's like, Todd, I don't know what to do. And so she ended up buying a replacement TV. Todd came over, hung the TV up, took the box, basically like made it look like nothing had even happened. And this was all in a matter of like an hour and a half. You know what I mean?
Wow.
And so it just kind of goes to show you that, the effort my wife like puts into some stuff, and, but at the same time, like, she was a wreck. So I get home and she's like, is there anything like that you notice? Is there anything that the kids could do that would annoy you or make you mad? I'm like, no, I don't know, other than break the TV or whatever. I don't think. So she's like, yeah, about that. So, but if you had a medical experience or whatever, you get home and there's not really much you care about at that point because you're a little loopy on whatever. And
yeah, you're just glad to be home.
Exactly. So at the time I didn't really care that. Even now it sucks because it's money, but you look back at it and laugh, but my 5-year-old he came into the other room and told my wife and, tried to tell her that the dog did it. But
oh, that's great. So going back to your story too, so the Fadal, yeah, I was just talking to somebody, a listener who was looking for a machine, and he was looking at like mini mills, and I was like, yeah, you might want to look at Fadals too, because the other thing I've heard from past guests and just online is that like most of the electronics behind the scene are all off the shelf components. It's not bespoke manufacturer components. It's like a ball door spindle motor and things that you can just buy.
Yeah, and I don't have a terribly experienced opinion about Haas, but I do, from reading and stuff like that. Like, I've never operated a Haas. I don't know, I don't know those machines inside and out or anything like that. But I've heard when you look at like the older Haas machines, I think they can be hard to support because I've heard Haas kind of actively suppresses a lot of that stuff of they don't want, parts, they don't want stuff. But when you look at the Fadal, I mean, there's 3 or 4 Fadal sites you can go to, and it's, if you wanted to rebuild the thing from scratch, with parts, like you could just start ordering stuff online. And like I said, the Hobbs switch that I bought for mine, so here's a relatively, not common setup for the Fadal, which was the air oil injection spindle. And I was able to find a part for that. I looked it up. It was like Napa had it, Amazon had it. You know what I mean? All these things. So it's not super common to have, CNC machine tool builders, and you're like, well, I can just get the part from Napa. You know what I mean? A lot of them are like, well, that's going to be $3,000. You know what I mean? For this custom, made electronics thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it just depends on where you go. But I think the mini mills are great machines. I definitely liked the Fadal because it had, the one biggest drawback for me personally that I've seen on the mini mills is, a little bit of size. I mean, obviously it's a mini mill, but, I really like the Fadal. Even the 3016 was really, it was tight, but it fit in the garage, no problem. It was mainly just getting it under but I had seen pictures, especially Practical Machinists, some other things with people getting them in garages and, firsthand verifications of people saying, yeah, they'll fit in a garage. So, if anybody's unsure, a 3016 will fit in a garage. And I've heard a 4020 will fit too, as long as it doesn't have the Z column or the extended Z. But yeah, I mean, so you've got a 3016 table, you've got like a 15 horse main motor, the standards are usually like the 7,500 RPM motor, or, they have, a lot of them have the 10K option. But I mean, for what it was a great machine. And then the other thing is a lot of people seem to be scared of like phase conversion for some reason. Everybody wants like the single phase. Does it run on single phase? Does it run on single phase? And I had the same concerns when I first started getting into CNC machining. And then once you kind of get over that cusp, you're like, it doesn't really matter. Like if you've got enough single phase juice to run that machine anyway, you can just turn that single phase juice into 3-phase juice, and it's not really a big issue.
Yeah, I've got a customer locally who I program for, and he has an Akuma Crown big bore lathe and a VF1, I think VFO or VF1, both on rotary phase converters in his garage. Like he's got an outboard garage that he built for this stuff, and like he has no problem.
Yeah, and that's the whole thing. It does take some sacrifice as far as like obviously machines use electricity, and so if you're one of those people that has 2 15 amp 110 circuits in your garage, like, yeah, you might need a little bit of an upgrade. So years ago, before I even got into the whole CNC thing, when we bought our house, that was one of my first big upgrades. Is just, we put a 200 amp panel in the house, and then I ended up pulling a 100 amp sub to the garage. And so that's just worked out awesome. But, now I have a 15 horse rotary phase converter. I'm probably going to end up buying one of the Phase Perfects at some point, especially the Speedio. It's like, it's a little weird on certain things. I do have an intermittent issue with I think it's like the brake resistor or something like that, which I think from just slowing down so fast.
Yeah, it's dumping a lot of power back.
Yeah, so it apparently dumps a lot of voltage back to the grid, and a lot of the phase converters don't like it. It's weird because it's intermittent, and I think it's, when I run short programs, and I'm running a lot of short programs, what I mean, where it's like a short cycle, or it's like a lot of tools back to back to back to back, and it's like start, stop, start, stop, start, stop, and then all of a sudden, boom, it'll like alarm out. But it's pretty easy to restart and redo. But I really never have any issues running. If it's running for 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever and stops and go gets another tool and starts up again, I never really have any issues with that.
So actually, while we're talking about the Fadal, one of our questions for you from Mozak Machine was, is there anything you regret about buying the Fadal? Pros and cons as a garage machine, and then would you have done it again?
Let's kind of like work backwards of would I do it again? 100% yes. Like I think the Fadal is a great machine. I think there's a couple. Obviously, the biggest drawback for most garage machines is the height. I mean, I think there's a lot of good machines. One that I looked at specifically, other than the Fadal, that you can always find cheap, are those Morosiki MV Juniors. But they're tall, man. Those things are like 10 feet tall. Yeah. You know what I mean? And then it's the whole column too. So I don't think there's any way to really even get it into a garage. But so there's a lot of machines like that would be perfectly fine, and they're dirt cheap. I see those things at auction for $1,000 or something. But I think as far as like an all-around machine that's pretty easy to work on, there's just a metric ton of help on Practical Machinist online. There's videos on how to operate them. The Fadal, it's just a great all-around machine. It definitely has its quirks and it definitely has its drawbacks. And, there's no doubt that it's a great machine, but it's also, it can't hold a candle to the Speedio.
Right.
You know what I mean? But it's also a tenth of the cost. So it's that catch 22 of, you know, people have always, and it's one of those questions I've gotten a lot just over the years is people are like, well, what would you do different? What would you do different? And my advice to people is always like, if you want to do something in your garage, you know, you can't go wrong with the Fadal. If you get your foot in the door, it lets you learn CNC. It's not all that terribly expensive. If you make a mistake or something happens, you can buy almost every single part for it. But, in retrospect, if I was trying to start a company or I had like some widget that I was already making and it's like, I want to hit the ground running, there's no doubt in my mind I would probably just go out and finance a new machine.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like a Speedio or a Haas or something like that. Like you have the warranty, because it's always hanging over your head that you're going to have like an issue.
Right.
You know what I mean? And if you're really trying to make products and get things out the door and that's like your sole moneymaker, do you want to go buy that 1980 Chevy C10 or do you want to go buy like a new Honda Civic? You know what I mean?
Right.
And not to say that people don't have issues with the new machines or that old machines don't run perfect. Like I said, I had the Fadal for 2 years, had a few little tiny issues with it, but nothing overall. But, if I had a certain thing that I was trying to make and get products out the door, I don't think it would have been the machine that I would have bought. But it was perfect for my situation and getting in the garage and learning CNC and doing all these other things.
Well, let's talk about the decision then to buy the Speedio. What was kind of the turning point where you're like, I'm going to get a new machine? Because that's, I know for a lot of my listeners and even for me, 3 years ago, I had a used machine and it was like, do I want to buy a new machine? Like, do I want to sign up for payments? Like, this is a big thing.
Yeah, and I definitely went through that a lot. And I actually came close to buying a new Speedio when I bought the Fadal. So I've actually wanted a Speedio since before since before I even had the Fadal. Like that was always my kind of goal machine of, hey, it fits in the garage, it's low power, even the S2Ds, stuff like that. I was like, hey, I could buy one of these used, but as a lot of people know, you're kind of in a tight spot with financing. You know what I mean? If you're trying like you either, for most people in the realm of reality, you're kind of looking at maybe like the used car range of like a 10, even, a lot of people like 10 to 20 grand is like a reach, you know what I mean? Or you have to save, you have to do something like that. So you're kind of looking at like an older machine or, a lot of times it's easier to just finance like a new machine. And I think that's where obviously Haas gets a lot of people, is with their financing and just being able to finance like a new machine, cause I think like, unless you're a business and you have the capital, it's hard to go out and buy like, hey, I'm going to go buy this machine from, 2015 or whatever. That's still, hey, yeah, new they're 120 grand or whatever, but this one uses 50 or 40.
Right.
Like most people don't have 50 grand to throw on a machine. And then, trying to dig up a finance company to loan you 50 grand for a used CNC machine, so that's kind of like the rock and a hard place. So I think for me, I have enough clientele, I have enough repeat jobs, and it was kind of the same thing with the Fadal of, there was just these little things that were just kind of getting for the work I do and switching materials a lot and things like that. I was really getting tired of cleaning it out all the time. It was one of those things where it's just all the chips are in the bottom. It takes 30 minutes or an hour to like flush, especially if you're changing over materials. Say I was running a bunch of different stuff like tie and copper and brass and whatever. And it's like, okay, now I want to switch to a big aluminum job. And then I'm going to take these chips to, recycle, those guys, they find, a sliver of a steel chip or something in there. And it's like, oh, now your 25 cents a pound is now 3 cents a pound. Or, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Now it's dirty.
yeah, now it's dirty chips or whatever. And like, okay, I've got 500 pounds of aluminum chips and you find one steel sliver. So, so that kind of thing just got annoying of, having to wash down the machine, shovel out chips, wash it down again, shovel it again. And then, so yeah, it was all the little stuff, all these little quirky things that you're just kind of like, well, a new machine would be nice. And so finally having the work and the repeat work and the repeat customers and stuff like that, it finally made it worth it to just, here's what it is, here's what the payment's going to be. Like I can just make it work.
Right. Yeah. Did you have like a specific financial goal you wanted to hit, or was it just a feeling of like, I've got enough work, I'm working on the shop enough, like I see the basics that are coming in, I'll be all right.
Yeah, I think it was more of just seeing the basics and then kind of I think the hard thing to estimate is how much more productive you can be. You know what I mean? You can take a stab at it, but you never really know
Right.
until you get there and you're like, okay, well, when I look at like a lot of the jobs that I was running, you're like, okay, well, if the Fadal is like, the Fadal doesn't really like going above 100 inches a minute at all. You know what I mean? And a lot of times I was programming way below there. I mean, I was at usually 60 minutes, 60 inches a minute, 80 maybe on certain things. Just it would get clunky. It didn't like it. You try to program a circle, like round parts or whatever. You're getting,
Eggs.
you're getting eggs. You know what I mean? So it's just stuff like that. So it did fine work, but it was just you just kind of had to program within like the limits of the machine.
Mm-hmm.
But you could take heavy cuts, you could drill big holes, you could do stuff like that. So it definitely had its benefits. The thing was burly, you know what I mean? So with the Speedio, obviously it's a whole different approach to programming. But when you start looking at the math, and you're going, okay, and I think I severely even underestimated the Speedio. Like a lot of the stuff, I was like, okay, well if I can double my feed rates, then that'll cut my parts in half roughly. And it's like more than that. It's crazy. A good example is I was making these little like round parts for my buddy Eric, Genuine Metalworks, so these little like V blocks. And so a big reduction on the Fadal was using a form tool. So I had a custom form tool ground for the V.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, I would basically just rough it out, because the first batch I think I did, I surfaced the whole V. The Fadal, that took forever. You know what I mean? To make them look clean enough to the point where I was happy with it. So I ended up just, hitting up AB Tools, getting a form tool custom ground. And so it had all the radiuses, radii in there, the V, everything else. So I could rough out the whole thing and then basically just take like a rough pass with the V and then a finish pass with the V. So that alone shaved, I don't know, it was like 6 or 7 minutes, something like that off the cycle time.
Mm-hmm.
But the first op for those parts was still 10-ish minutes, something like that in the Fadal, which is fine. Same thing. I'm at home, parts run while I'm sitting here, go load a couple blocks, come back in. So I think that was actually the first job that I ran on the Speedio when I got it up and running. And so I ended up running 2 of those. So I was running one part complete or one part first op in the Fadal was about 10 minutes. I ended up setting it up in the Speedio. I ended up set up 2 blocks of 4 parts, first and second op. So I was doing 8 parts complete in 13 minutes.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and so like the big time suck was in the Fadal was the V, and so I got that solved using the form tool. But then it was also I do this kind of I forget who even sent me the file. I saw it somewhere. And it was kind of this like faux knurling on the outside with a thread mill.
Mm-hmm.
So you do like a left and a right hand thread, but it's kind of shallow. So it just ends up giving you this like diamond knurl pattern. And so the same thing, it was just labor intensive or just time intensive on the Fadal. And it's just to watch the Speedio just rip through that thing at like 200 inches a minute or whatever, it's crazy. And so a lot of these things, it can finish parts before the Fadal can even change tools.
That's awesome.
So,
well, we had a ton of questions about the Speedio, so let's jump into those. Paul Alfaro, he asked, what's the next upgrade for the Brother? Fourth, some sort of automation, another Brother, all of the above? What are you thinking?
Oh man, I'd love to get a fourth, but Do you have a fourth? Do you guys have a fourth?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's like, I like to get it for the sheer amount of just learning, and I think kind of being able to elevate your parts and learn different techniques and stuff like that. But man, they're not cheap.
No, no, they're
when,
not.
when you look at it, you're like, that is a good chunk of the cost of a second Speedio.
Yeah.
So, and then having it kind of eat up the tape, you know what I mean? I think it's worth it, obviously, if you have the parts for it, but it's kind of like that cost benefit of now you have something that eats up like a lot of your table space, and if you're not using it, it kind of slows down other parts. So I'd like to have a force just to learn, but I don't know if I would. I don't know if I'm going to buy one for this machine yet. But
I think that's fair.
I could also see myself buying a second Speedio, even in the garage, and it's just even now running parts. I still have a full-time job, so that obviously eats up a lot of time. So it's kind of one of those things where like, well, if I could do more parts in less time, you know.
Nope.
So it's kind of weird to think about buying two machines that you're only going to run, 20 hours a week or something like that. But it's the fact of trying to pack that much work into so little time. But I feel like there's a lot more I can do, and this is one of those things I've talked with Ken a lot about, is just the automation type stuff. I see a lot that I forget his name, but Austere Manufacturing making the buckles.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so that stuff just fascinates me, man. With the pneumatic gripper and the just like, hey, let's put a tray out and just run like nonstop. That kind of like in machine automation to me is just incredible. But you really got to kind of have your own product, or you got to have something. It's hard to justify when you're like, oh, I'm running 50 of these parts or whatever, and then it might be 3 months until I run these parts again.
Yeah. It's a very specific workflow, but it works so well for like that size part and like that kind of quantity for sure.
Exactly. So like what he's doing with it, it's incredible. You know what I mean? And so it's just one of those things of, I would love to get into stuff like that and learn stuff like that. But for a lot of the stuff that I do, I don't think it really makes sense. So just trying to reevaluate that and figure out, upgrades that I could do that are worth it. And when I bought the Speedio, that's where I just kind of went all in and got the spindle probe and the tool setter. And that, like, that's another thing about the Fadal is like, once you have those things, you're like, I can't go back.
Yeah, it's tough. We've got our older TCS2A and then our two Speedios. And like anytime I have to run anything on the TC, it's like, yeah, it's a good machine, but like it'd be nice to have a probe and a tool setter and like
Yeah.
tool break detection and all that stuff.
Yeah. The tool break detection, I think, is like probably one of the best things. Like, I love the spin. Don't get me wrong. I love the probe. And I think like as a package, they're absolutely imperative on like a new machine that I would buy. But if I had to choose, I'd probably take the tool setter.
It's a
Just
lot of time savings. Like just being able to load up like 20 tools and then hit go and walk away is so nice.
Yeah, it's that because I had the Heimer on the Fadal, and the Heimers. I mean, it's especially the Fadal has had all the kind of macros built in, so it would do like circle finding. So I mean, you had to jog over and manually touch off, but it had all that stuff like in the background where it's like you could find a center line, you could find a corner, you could do all these, you could have it do all these things for you, and then you would just manually touch off the locations with the Heimer. So I feel like, don't get me wrong, the probe is way faster and does a lot of these things way better and way more accurately. But as far as like time saved and peace of mind, I think the tool breakage detection is probably giving me the biggest peace of mind about just letting parts run unattended out in the garage while I'm doing other stuff. You know what I mean? To be able to have, to be able to run through 10 tools or whatever and have the machine just go, oh, check, 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 check the drill, check the tap, check the thing after, and then in the Speedio, it's so fast that, okay, if I'm adding 10 seconds or 15 seconds to a cycle time, when it means I don't even have to think about it and I'm not going to ruin $300 worth of tools.
Oh yeah.
You know what I mean? It's just night and day, and it's already saved my butt a couple times on stupid stuff. So it's totally worth it.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing for sure. Let's see. Karakuri PGH asked, what do you think of the Brother Control? What does it compare most to, and what has maintenance been?
So the Brother Control, it's one of those things, and this may sound like a weird opinion. Like, I don't really care about the control that much. I know some people put a lot of stock into like how easy it is to use, and I get that to a degree. And I know that's like a big quote unquote plus of like the Haas, but I'm one of those people that just kind of nerds out on whatever it is. So the way I look at it is it's usable. You just got to figure out what's there. And some things may be worse than others, but I'll figure it out. You know what I mean? Or, once you get used to it, it's not, there's things that are easier or harder to learn, but once you learn it, it doesn't really matter to me. So I'd take I'd take way better mechanics and a machine with a control. Like, I mean, obviously as long as it functions or it doesn't have any major issues, like the usability to me doesn't really matter that much. But that being said, it feels very similar to the first drill tap that I had that was the FANUC control.
Mm-hmm.
And there's lots of menus and there's things that you jog through, and once you kind of get used to it, it's not super intuitive with the, it's not like using an iPad or something where it's like press this button, press this button, press this button. It's like, oh crap, okay, go to this page, okay, go back, okay, go to this. Wait, what page was that? You know what I mean? So there's a lot of that at first where you're jumping back and forth between menus because you can't remember what was on what page or what entry did what thing. And so there's a lot of things that I wrote down and go back there. But once you kind of get it figured out, it's pretty smooth. But I think a good example was probably the probing. You know what I mean? Where I think from what I've seen with something like a Haas, it's like all on the screen, right? You just kind of like, I want this, I want to probe this board,
Right.
So on the Speedio, it's just got like its macros or whatever. So if you're like, oh, if I want to pick up Z or something, I jog over and then it's okay. Oh, I go in here and I run macros 710 or okay, program 710 or whatever it is, go. Okay. Right. So you got your little cheat sheet with all the macros, you know what I mean? And then you gotta jump to the macro, you gotta jump to the macro variable chart and punch in like your macro variables of like your bore size or your, your slot size or your part size or whatever you want to do with that, and then jump back and run the macro. But I mean, it's still pretty quick. And once you kind of have everything figured out, I don't think it's an issue.
Definitely. Yeah. And then what about maintenance? Have you had any issues or things you had to call Yamazin up for?
I've had no issues with it. The very first day when they got it set up, I had a little bit of a heart attack because we kind of crashed the tool setter.
Oh no.
Yeah. So it wasn't bad. It put a little ding in the anvil. It was the install, like, this is stuff that doesn't really bug me because it wasn't a big thing. It wasn't a huge issue. And Yamazin's been awesome. The sales guy here in Southern California, my sales guy is Brian. He's been awesome. I've talked to him for he's put up with my stupid questions and whatever for years, and I told him a couple years ago, like, Brian, I'm going to buy a Speedio. And so when we were finally sitting there, like signing papers and stuff, I'm like, dude, I told you I was going to buy a Speedio. So, and then the install guys were cool. And, Ken was working there for a while. So I was hoping he was going to be able to come out and do my install. But some of the other guys that came out, they were super cool. And I guess they had changed like a relay or something, because I ended up getting the Blum setter and probe.
Mm-hmm.
And so the guys were telling me, like, dude, they just changed like a bunch of the stuff. They gave us like a different relay. And so they had to like pin out everything like manually.
Oh.
And try to figure out, because they had the install sheet or whatever for everything, where everything was supposed to go. But they're like, they changed the relay and they haven't gave us like updated things. We got to figure out. So it was like, they literally had to figure out each wire and where it went for what, so it was like an issue with like the block skip signal.
Right.
And so they get everything done and they're like, okay, it's ready to go. And so my first time I'm standing in front of the Speedio and it's like, I go to press the tool setter and it just keeps going. It just keeps going.
Ooh.
And so I had a 1/4 inch end mill in there, and I didn't have it like super tight, and it cracked the end mill off and just kind of like dinged the tool setter. But they checked everything; it's all good. Like no issues with spindle or anything like that. I don't think it was, because I stopped it as soon as I was like, oh, that's not good. And then so they came out, they fixed, they replaced the anvil, they do all that kind of stuff. But yeah, it was. I look at the tech and I'm just like, you saw that, right? Like, that's not, he's like, no, does nothing to do with you. And so they fixed a couple of things, and I guess they had reversed a wire and checked something. And then before they actually set it up, they didn't check the wire again before they had, said, oh yeah, it's good to go. And then it was like something was reversed or whatever.
Oh no.
But like overall, it's a good experience. And there's some people that get all crazy about. I'm pretty laid back, all that stuff. Like stuff happens, people make mistakes. Like, you know, for me, it's not, you know, if something happens, it's when it happens. You know what I mean? And how do they handle it? So, you know, to me, the customer service and the follow up and just being able to like text some of these guys when I need something, or, you know, have like an open conversation. You know, it's not, you know, I've heard other companies where it's like you call and it's like, well, we need a tech guy and we need this and we need that. You know, I'm pretty much on a first name basis with all the dudes from Yamazin. And when I need something, like they're super responsive. You know, so that I think means a lot to me, as far as I genuinely feel like I've been treated just as good, you know, as like these big companies. And even when the tech guys were out there, we were kind of having this, you know, conversation where it's such a trip when you think about it, that, you know, even like your shop or my, you know, or my little garage or something like that, like, you know, to think that, you know, obviously these machines get produced by the hundreds, and just where that machine ends up, you know, it could be one shop's heart and soul, you know, and it's like their biggest purchase and it's the biggest money they've ever spent, you know, and then you could have another shop where it's like, oh yeah, we're installing 200 of these things tomorrow.
Right. Yeah.
You know, and so, you know, and obviously the install guys see it because, you know, they come here and they hang out with me in my garage, and it's like we're chatting and it's like, oh, you guys want some lunch or drinks or whatever, you know what I mean? And you're kind of talking to them about what the stuff they're doing, and you're interested in what they're doing and what's going on and blah, blah, blah. And then, you know, you have like a Boeing or you have, you know, something like that. And they're like, oh yeah, just let us know when you get these 15 machines up and running, you know?
Right.
So it's just this total kind of dichotomy of the difference between shops and what a certain machine purchase can mean to one person or one shop as opposed to a different shop. You know, some shops, it's obviously just a line item on a purchase, and it's like, okay, yeah, we're having more of these machines put in, you know, because we need to run more parts. And
right, zero motion related to it. Like,
yeah, zero motion. It's a numbers thing. It's a, hey, we need more thing to make more parts, make more profit, do this. And then you got, you know, guys like me or guys like you know, where you're like, you know, you've been agonizing over, you know, 6 months or a year. Like if you want to buy a first machine or a second machine or something like that, you know, it's just like such a huge decision. So I really enjoyed those guys coming out and just being able to chat with them. And, you know, the whole experience start to finish with Yamazin was awesome for me.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad to hear it. And then our last question about the brothers was from Kyle Maury. He says, real cost of a Speedio, and how does the 30 taper tooling do in steel?
The 30 taper has been great. I run one of the jobs that I run is these steel D-rings. People have probably seen them. They're for like a hitch skid. And one of the issues I was having was getting the 1-inch it's like a 900 thou through hole in the middle of the ring through 1018 through 1-inch 1018. So nothing crazy, but just trying to interpolate that with an end mill or plunge down or ramp in, or, you know, trying all these different techniques, and you're just nothing. And this isn't a drawback on the Speedio. I had the same issue with the Fadal, but the Fadal had no problem drilling holes.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so the first time I ran it on the Speedio, it was like, okay, I'm gonna just drill a 1/2-inch hole and drop in with a 375 end mill, and it's you can either ramp down in steps and do the whole hole, and that was just taking forever, you know what I mean? Or I was like, okay, I'm just gonna drill like a 1/2-inch clearance hole and then drop in like a 3/8 end mill, and so physically it works real well, but you just can't get the chips out fast enough. And so you would just hear this like crunching sound. You know what I mean? You could just hear the chips being recut. And so I finally ended up just dropping in on a Tungaloy. So I ended up at a 22 millimeter drill. And the same thing, this is through Yamazin. Just text their tooling guy. It's just like, hey, here's what I want to do. You know, what do I need? And so he set me up with a Tungaloy drill. And I just ran this job the other day, and it was like butter. And it was right at, I think it's kind of right at the limits of a 30 taper, you know, or like a Speedio type machine. Cause it was pretty much pegging the meter at, and this was talking to Ken, I was running about 1,000 RPM and pushing about 5 inches a minute, but it runs right through, like no problem. You know, I could probably push a little harder to get it to break the chip, a little better because I'm getting some like long curls right now, but it's fine. But so much faster. But then, as far as the 30 taper and steel, it's a different method of programming. The you could put like a half-inch end mill or something in the Fadal and just hog it off. You know what I mean? At 50 inches a minute or 60 inches a minute or something like that. And the Speedio, it's like, okay, you can turn around and run 150 inches a minute and a light, it's just death by a thousand cuts type thing.
Right.
Where
Well,
it's
there was
just
that
like,
guy on the Brother Slack that was running 1018 at like what 600 inches a minute or something. But it's like
yes.
it's like a 10 or 20,000 step over versus like hogging, at 50 inches a minute.
Yeah, and so that's basically what I've been doing the same thing. And I'm, in all honesty, I'm probably on the conservative side, but I've had really good luck. If you've got the clearance, like inside holes doesn't work as great unless you've got enough room, but I've really kind of gravitated, especially for the Speedios, towards like 6, 7 flutes. Because the same thing, you can just run like you can run a super light radial, like a 10 thou radial, you know what I mean? And you're running full depth, full depth, light radial, and you're just jamming. And the same thing, like the Fadal is not going to run like that.
Right.
You know what I mean? But, to go watch, I got some aluminum parts I'm running out right now and conservative on that too, probably. And I'm running a 3/8 end mill at 250 inches a minute roughing. You know what I mean? And it's so much faster. Even with the light radial passes, I think it ends up being just way faster.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's like you said, it's a different way to look at programming for sure. Like I talk to a lot of people who are hesitant about Brothers, and I'm like, yeah, you're not going to put a 1 inch end mill in there and just like try to hog stuff. Like that's just not this machine. But like you said, light radial, super fast. The machine loves it. It's made for that kind of stuff. It's super low or super low weight and able to just go that quickly. Like it actually hits those numbers, whereas some machines aren't that highly dynamic.
Yeah, and I think I think a lot of people need to really look at what parts they need made. You know what I mean? I don't, and then the other thing is like the table size. I mean, it's pretty much the same size as the Fadal. I mean, obviously it's the metric, so it's whatever it ends up being, a 29-inch table or something, or travel or whatever it is. But size wise, capacity wise, like it's almost spot on for what the Fadal was. I think that's why I was so into it even more after running the Fadal. I was like, man, this has pretty much been perfect for the last couple of years. Like, there's a couple jobs where you get where like, okay, a 40/20 machine would be nice for, these 5 jobs or something that I ran. Like I did these posts a while ago where I had to slot, 30 inches or something like that. And they weren't super critical or anything. So it was easy enough to just shift the parts down. But, it would have been easier to put in a 40/20 machine and do the whole thing in one shot,
Right.
but it is what it is. But the overall like I mean, it's just crazy to me because the overall footprint and the weight and everything else, like they really are like ideal garage machines. I mean, it's, the power requirements, they're a little quirky with like needing the transformer or whatever for most people. And, so it is a little bit more fidgety, needing like a transformer and then phase converter, or, a little bit more money if you're going to run like a phase perfect or something like that. But, I mean, man, weight, that thing slid right under the garage door, like no problem. It just looks more svelte, just looks like it just doesn't take up as much room. The funny part is the travels are the same, but the actual shell of the machine, it's like a foot smaller than the Fadal
Wow.
was. So in a small space, makes a huge difference.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And then I don't know about you guys, but I looked at like the 500s and some of the other stuff, and the price difference was like nothing.
Oh yeah, we I mean, we don't have the space limitations you do. Like we've got a small
Yeah.
shop, but like we knew it was either going to be a 700 or 1,000 for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I looked at the 500, and they gave me the price. It was like a $2,000 difference or something.
Yeah.
Like, okay, when you're spending 6 figures for a machine or almost there, you know what I mean? It's like, are you gonna save $2,000? When it's your own machine? Like, no.
Right.
You know what I mean? For that little of a benefit, it's different if you're like, okay, we need to pack 15 of these into a certain thing, and it's only going to run this one part, and you're just trying to get a certain amount of spindles per square foot or something. Then yeah, I could see buying 500s or 300s or whatever else. But for kind of a generic machine, if you're looking at buying a Speedio, there's literally no point in buying a 500.
Yeah.
If you got like the room or you don't have some sort of other limitation. But yeah, I think so. So somebody else had asked about the cost. I don't know about you. I don't want to get too much into it because I think they kind of had some of that stuff in the like sales contract.
Right. Yeah. You don't need to discuss, the exact
Yeah.
numbers or anything, but
So yeah, I mean it's a nice sports car,
yeah.
but it's about twice the cost of a mini mill from what I looked at.
Yeah.
Um, uh,
I think a lot of people get hung up on is if you get a quote, you're like, oh, that's a lot of money. And then, but like, I have built comparable like VF2s or something like
I think
that.
everybody's done the same thing.
And they're like within a couple grand of each other.
Yeah,
Like when you
yeah.
actually add all of the options that come standard on a Speedio, all the IO that's standard, coolant through prep, all that stuff, like they get a lot closer than you would imagine.
Well, just the control, right? I think one of the things that people get sucked in with the Haas is, the perfect example to me is like the high speed machining.
Yeah.
Like it's freaking 2020, 2022. You're not going to get a machine. You know what I mean? To the fact that they're making that, you've got current computers, you've got current tech, you've got all this current. The fact that you even have to pay money to turn on high speed machining is insane to me.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But that's one of those things where it's like that. It doesn't show up on the base number when you go to like, oh, starts at, you know what I mean? But then when you start digging in, like you said, when you get to that bottom line, when you've built out like a similar spec machine, it's really not that much different. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And yeah, you might get a blowout, and it's like everything else. Okay. I looked around forever, maybe thinking I could snag like a trade show machine or I could snag some sort of like light used demo machine. And don't get me wrong, like those deals are out there. You know what I mean? But I think just with the timing, and then I think for me, a lot of this, I think, without getting like political type stuff, it's just the timing on the machine. That was another big decision for me, was like, this stuff is not going to get any cheaper.
No. And
Yeah,
like, but speaking of like those deals, like there were no trade shows for the last few years. So like you can't get a
exactly.
trade show demo if there's no trade show.
Exactly. So that was like a big thing for me. I'm like, okay, I'm kind of ready to buy the machine, but that was the stuff I was thinking about. I'm like, nobody's been doing anything for the past 2 years. Nothing's been going on. There's been no shows. There's been stuff like that. I'm like, the fact that I was able to talk to the sales guy and he's like, we have like 4 machines right now, like ready to go if you want. And I'm just like, all right, let's do it. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Cause I'm just like, I don't want to be, I had pretty much locked down the sale on the Fadal, and it was just like, man, I don't want to get stuck holding the bag either. You know what I mean? I don't want to have the machine leave and then not have something or have like an issue. You know what I mean? Trying to hunt for a machine, and it's that opportunity cost that gets you.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Where you're like, okay, so maybe I saved 10 grand or whatever by buying a trade show machine or something like that. But how much in business do you lose by not having a machine for 3 months?
Right.
You know what I
Exactly.
mean? Or something like that. So it's like, okay, the fact that I could buy a new machine, have it delivered when I want, have it set up when I want, and I only ended up having like a 2-week gap or whatever in between. The guy that bought my Fadal ended up moving it like a week earlier than intended, which was fine. You know what I mean? And that's just some of the stuff you got to kind of roll with, but it worked out. You know what I mean? I was able to get some stuff shuffled around, was able to move the machine in, get it all up and running, and it was good to go.
Awesome.
And then
Yeah.
the setup was pretty quick. I mean, obviously you guys have done it. Like the setup's pretty quick.
Yeah. It's about a
So
day. It's not like
yeah,
very involved at all.
yeah, it's crazy when you see some of these like, giant machines or whatever. It's like, okay, it's going to be like 3 weeks. You know what I mean?
Right.
They're delivering pallets and pallets of parts and things. And, they have like a whole team out there doing stuff. It's like, no, we're just going to pretty much dolly this in and hook a couple things up and you're ready to go.
Yeah. It's like 5 boxes in addition to the machine, like, tiny cardboard boxes for like the probe and stuff. And
Yeah,
you're done. It's like, okay, cool.
exactly. And the things like 95% of the way complete, like as it comes out of the crate.
Yeah, exactly. Well, to step back and kind of look overall picture from the Patreon, Paul Sokoff asked, what challenges and successes have you had having a machine at home?
It's one of those catch-22 things, right? It's kind of talking, or especially listening to like Jim's podcast with you the other day. It definitely takes an understanding significant other and or wife, because I have little kids. I have an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old, and I'm married, and we have the house and all that stuff. But there would be benefits to having a shop and there's benefits to being at home. The big drawback of being at home obviously is just space. You know what I mean? There's stuff that I would love to have, like a forklift and an auto saw are probably two of the biggest things. You know what I mean? So right now, small stuff or small jobs, I've got a Jet 1018 that's actually kind of on the big side. Then who was it? Was it Jim that was talking about, or somebody was talking about the saws where like every machinist has the like Harbor Freight pant saw?
Right.
You know what I mean? And so it's like, I kind of skipped that thing. I just found a killer deal on this Jet 1018, but like, man, the thing's like kind of massive, you know what I mean, for a small shop, but it just runs so good. And I've put new guides and stuff in it. And I just don't have the heart to get rid of it because it cuts so well. And I'm able to cut plate and stuff like that with it because it's got a big enough throat. But it's stuff like that where you really got the drawbacks of the small shopper. You really have to pick and choose about what's important and what's not important. And, even these guys, like you guys, you say you've got a little bit smaller shop, like space is a premium. So even more so with like a garage shop or a really small shop is like space is an even more premium. So the more just junk you have laying around or the more like tools, you really have to pick and choose about what's important, what's not important. But then even on just like the mentality side of it, you do get sucked into, home stuff and it's hard to disconnect. So it's a blessing and a curse, right? Of I can be running parts and, come inside and watch a movie with my wife or play with my kids or, we can be out front, like kicking the ball around or doing, throwing a football while parts are running. You know what I mean? Right. So it's all kind of the stuff that you would imagine. And you really just kind of have to step back sometime. You really have to just kind of step back sometime and try to balance that stuff out. And it really is just a balance. It's, there's times where you get buried and you're trying to get work done or, you're frustrated or things are just not, you're up super late or you're trying to get jobs out the door, or you run 100 parts and all of a sudden something's wrong. You're like, oh my gosh,
right.
And now you have to rerun these things. So that kind of thing of being there and then having a family that still needs attention, all that kind of stuff.
Dog or kid?
The dog. Yeah, she's got like a little squeaky toy. So, it's just one of those things that it's always something, man.
So, yeah, speaking of a home shop,
Yeah, speaking of the home shop. So this is also the joys of having so in short, yeah, kind of the question is it's the same stuff that most people would imagine, you know what I mean? It's one of those things where you try to balance it as best as you can, and sometimes it goes your way and sometimes it doesn't. And there's definitely benefits and there's definitely drawbacks, but it's the same. It's just different benefits and drawbacks there would be of having like a shop space. You know what I mean?
Right.
It would be nice, as much as I would love having time to just turn it off and go to a shop and you feel like you get more done sometimes because you can focus. It's also just super nice to be able to walk out 5 feet and turn on the machine and start making parts. You know what I mean? And then, like that, hey, my wife wants to go for a walk around the block. My kids want to go throw the football for, 20 minutes, or like you're home to do those sorts of things.
Yeah, that's awesome.
But then obviously I have a regular job. So the big thing for me is like the commitment. Like I just don't want to pay, you know what I mean? For, I don't know everybody else. I'm in Southern California. So it's just one of those things, like shop space is just incredibly expensive. Even for a small space, it would probably be $3,000 plus a month.
Right.
You know what I mean? Just for rent. And then you factor in all the ancillary stuff of getting electric set up, internet, all the like HOA services or whatever for whatever thing you're in, as far as the, the industrial complex, whatever other charges they have. You know what I mean? It's not hard for that stuff to all add up. Whereas
your overhead all of a sudden is 5x or 10x what it is now.
Yeah, exactly. And you're home. And then the same thing. It's like, okay, when you look at the sheer numbers, like, man, I would 100% rather buy another Speedio and figure out how to fit that thing in here than pay twice that amount to just go rent a shop somewhere.
Yeah, that's totally understandable.
But, at the same time, you're like, man, it really would be nice to have a forklift.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, it's the ever-present question I think for a lot of us is like, where's that line? What kind of you're always making a compromise if you have a family and a shop. So it's like, where do you want to make the compromises?
Exactly. And then I think especially where we live in Orange County, if you're I see a lot of, I mean, Jim's a perfect example, you know what I mean? It's, other people and where you live, you sometimes have a little bit different options, you know what I mean? I would love to build a shop, you know what I mean? But I mean, we have zero room.
Right.
It's literally the garage or nothing. And there are some houses around here, but you're talking $2 million,
Yep.
so
Yeah.
it's just not even really feasible, you know what I mean? And the lots here are small, I mean, the house, the lot that our house is on is like 8,500 square feet. You know what I mean? So you talk to other people in parts of the country, they're like, well, how many acres you got? You know
Right.
what I mean?
You're like, what's an acre? Like,
Yeah,
what are you
what's an
talking-
acre? Yeah, like a tenth of an acre, or like so that kind of stuff. It's just, I would love to have a shop. I'd love to, I think that would be my ideal situation, would be having, it'd be sweet to have a 2,000-3,000 square foot shop like on your property and still kind of have that home shop experience, but have an actual shop experience,
Right.
but you're in a little bit more control, because I also don't like the idea of just paying rent to somebody for, paying them 50 grand a year or whatever for nothing, basically.
Yeah, I totally understand. His other question was, besides 3D printing reminders to turn on shielding gas, what else have you used your 3D printer for in the shop?
So I have the Prusa MK3 S Plus,
Mhm.
and that thing has been awesome. And that was actually my, broken neck experiment. That was my dad has been big into 3D printing, and that's honestly where I learned a lot of stuff. Is my dad, kind of forcing me against my will as a kid to work on the plumbing and do oil changes and stuff, like all the stuff that you hated when you're like 10.
Right.
And now you're like, oh man, I'm so glad I like learned all that stuff. So my dad's been kind of into 3D printing, and a couple of buddies have been into 3D printing, and so just kind of gone over some stuff. And so when I broke my neck and I was sitting at home, I was like, oh, this might be a good time to sit at the dining room table and put together a 3D printer. So I did that, and it's great. Like I use it for mainly and the reason I went with the Prusa and talking to it's pretty much idiot proof.
Right.
You know what I mean? It really is the like print and go. If you want, I always told myself like I didn't really want another hobby, as far as like I really have no interest in 3D printing as like a hobby. Like I don't want to work on the printer. I don't want to troubleshoot the printer. I just want to buy filaments and put them in the printer and print stuff that I want.
Right.
So on that aspect, it's been awesome. But the majority of the stuff I use it for right now is just organizational type stuff. You know what I mean? You can print little trays. You can print, I have one of those Sigmund welding tables, and I've got like all the little like ball couplers, for the clamp downs. And so I made like a little tray for those. I made a bunch of little trays it's super easy to print trays for like end mills and stuff. You've got like used end mills or whatever. Okay. Have a rack for halves, have a rack for 3/8, have a rack for eighths or whatever. So you take them out, and it's tools that you don't really want to put away because you need to use them, but you need the holder right now for something else.
Right.
So it's just stuff like that. Like you can make all that stuff that's custom done. Like probably one of the things that I enjoyed the most making was I printed up a set of anybody that has those Bondus T-handle wrenches, like knows how like insanely stupid their like countertop little organizer thing is. There's just never a good place to put them, and they're just so awkward. So I threw those things in the trash, and I printed up these little like angle brackets that I just ended up screwing to the side of my wood top workbench. And then the T handles just drop in there, and it's super clean. They're accessible, they're organized. So it's just the kind of quality of life things has really made an improvement on the 3D printer. So that's pretty much the majority of what I use it for that. And then side note on the Speedio, that's actually one of the things that I kind of underestimated about the Speedio was the quality of life type stuff of the chip shoveling and loading programs and editing programs and being able to jump back and forth between stuff. You get so obsessed with like, oh, the machine's so fast and it does this fast and it tool changes fast and it does everything fast. And so what I really think I underestimated was the actually just use of things, you know what I mean? And just how much simpler it's made life.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I think anybody who's listened to the show for a while, one of the things I said when we first got ours was like, I mean, our Kittimer was RS-232. So
Yeah.
transferring a 200 kilobyte program or a 300 kilobyte program was like 10 minutes. So
Yeah.
like just in program transfers alone, I save hours a week. You know,
Yeah.
it's
It's
crazy.
crazy.
Yeah.
And then being able to like jump into a program and jump out of a program and edit a program real quick. You know what I mean? It like I could do all that stuff on the Fadal, but I pretty much just drip fed everything from the cow motion. But on the Speedio, it's just so much faster. Like that stuff is just so much faster, and you kind of just take it for granted when you start to get into use it. And you're like, man, this really like the actual like day to day like use of it, like it probably makes up just as much time as the machine being fast.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I think that really applies to any new machine. Like I think that's a good excuse to get a new machine if you have, like you said, a product or something like that. Like it's just in the little stuff you'll save so much time.
I think especially for these guys, like guys that are getting into it, or like me, where you don't, it's just different too. If you know what you're gonna make and you're making, 1,000 of the same thing, you just need to evaluate, because there are, like with the Fadal, it's like it probably wouldn't have mattered as much if you're able to put like a giant fixture plate in there and run, you know what I mean? If you're never doing a tool change, or you're changing a tool and you're running, 300 parts on like a pallet or some giant fixture plate, and then you switch a tool and you do the same, you know what I mean?
Right.
But I do so many job changeovers and pick up material and, switch between tie and copper and brass and aluminum. And it's just being able to like bam, 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 just pick these things up and start a new job and throw it in there and have it run. It's just incredible.
Definitely. Definitely. Well, Joe, that brings me to the last question I ask every guest, which is, what did you research this week? And it can be anything and everything. It doesn't have to be machining related, but what's been on your mind and what have you been doing a deep dive on?
We have actually been looking into puppy training.
Okay.
So a couple months ago, we got a Rhodesian Ridgeback pup, and she's an awesome dog. But it's just she's definitely learning some stuff. But that's one of those things where it's like we're trying to decide. She's about 4 months now, so she's kind of in that sweet spot of she's starting to learn more commands and she's starting to do that thing. So, do we want to have somebody come in? We've been watching videos on like YouTube and stuff to try to figure out, do we want to just train her ourselves? And some of these like in-home places are so expensive.
Oh yeah, I bet.
It's crazy. So we've been kind of researching that and figuring out, how much of this can we figure out ourselves? And she's just so like rambunctious, but she's a great dog.
That's great. And actually, I missed and saved one question for the end to kind of let you plug it. Paul Afaro also asked, when are you dropping more wallets? So where can people find you online? Do you have any products coming out that you can, plug, anything like that?
Yeah, so I have a couple things that I make. I do make the wallets. That was my first Kickstarter. That was kind of like the thing that got everything started. I do have some in stock. It's just one of those things, man, with a regular job and then just getting buried with job shop work, it just, your own stuff always just tends to like, because there's nobody asking. You know what I mean? I mean, people ask, but it's just like your own stuff. So you're like, okay, this can wait, this could wait, this could wait.
Right.
And so I did get some more blanks cut for titanium ones. I'm hoping to get to them. I got a couple of like big jobs right now that I got to get pushed out. So I'm hoping I can get to those after. I do have some plain, I think I've got hard anodized gray and some other silver one. Speaking of the dog.
Yeah.
So, just trying to get those done. And then I also make the angle finders for tube bending. So I've made a bunch of those on the Fadal. I still actually have a bunch of those. So I have those, and I also have the Wixie digital angle finder that goes in there if people wanted to get them as a combo. I do have a website. It's www.randomfab.us. It's not that great because it's another one of those things of when you're working part-time and doing everything yourself, you're like, I really need to work on the website, but I also don't have time to work on the website. But then I'm also not sure how much I want to pay somebody right now to work on a website, because it's not really like a primary driver of, jobs and funds and stuff for me. So it's, most of my stuff is word of mouth and friends of friends and stuff like that. And it's mostly job shop work. So it's just, trying to keep up with that has been a big challenge.
Totally. Yeah. Well, you get to like the minimum viable product for a website when you're a job shop, and you're like, yep, good enough. Like if people start commenting on it, I guess I'll get a change. But
Yeah, and so that's the thing. It's a good. I feel like Instagram is probably a better showcase of like ability and stuff like, and it's just seems to be where I do majority of my business right now. So it's just so much easier to keep that current than it is to go like continually upload pictures to a website, and it's just so much like the e-commerce and some of the other stuff where you're just like to do a dive into that stuff and figure it all. It's just like a whole different, you know what I mean? I wish I had the money to just pay somebody to do it all
right.
for me.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Because it's not worth it to me to really sit there and spend hours to like learn everything because I'm just have no interest in it. But you want a better website, but you're just like, it's just not that important to me.
Yeah, you're a busy guy, and I totally understand that. I have been in that same exact position where you're like, I've only got so many hours in the day, and
Exactly.
I'm going to prioritize the stuff that directly makes me money, and then everything else, like if I've got time, maybe I'll get into it, but I don't.
Exactly. Programming and going out and pushing buttons and running parts like makes money. Like me sitting on my butt for 4 hours, like trying to figure out a website and pick and choose and edit photos. Like it doesn't really seem to matter that much.
Yeah, definitely. Well, speaking of that, thank you so much for taking the time, Joe, to come on the podcast. It's been great to get to know you a little better. I've seen your Instagram and we've talked over there, but it's always nice to put a face to a name and all that stuff. And I really appreciate the time.
Yeah, exactly. I appreciate the same thing, man. I just to kind of add in at the end is just, I feel like this community is so great, and just the people I've got to meet, and in all honesty, like everybody's so supportive, and I try to give that back as much as I can by helping, people that message me or want to know certain things and just talk to people about. I'm so into it, and I know a lot of the people that I talk to are the same way. So it's been one of these kind of hobbies slash quote unquote, jobs that the people that are into it seem to be very into it. And it makes it easy for like-minded people that when you want to nerd out on like nerding out type stuff, it's made it very easy.
Oh yeah, definitely. I completely agree. I love the Instant Machinist community and everybody in it. One of the reasons I love doing this podcast is to get to talk to everybody in it and just share more about it.
Yeah, and then just the podcast too, man. It's just one of those things where you pick up at least one or two things, everything, that you're just like, okay, I'm gonna write this down so I can go spend hours on the internet researching this later.
Right. Yeah, I've got a new rabbit hole for the week or whatever.
Exactly.
Oh yeah.
So it gets addicting, man.
Definitely. Well, thank you. And thank you to all the Patreon supporters. It helps me send people like Joe headsets so that you guys have good audio. And thanks for listening. I'll be back next week.